Imagine for a moment that everything you thought you knew about Jesus' deepest teachings had been deliberately hidden for nearly 2 millennia. Picture a text, lost in the sands of time, containing direct words from the Nazarene teacher that never made it into the Gospels we know today. This ain't some made-up story or a wild conspiracy theory without a shred of evidence. This is the documented truth of the Gospel of Thomas, a manuscript that lay buried not just in the ancient Egyptian dirt, but also stifled in the silence of religious institutions that preferred these revelations never see the light of day. The moment archaeologists unearthed the Nag Hammadi manuscripts in 1945, the world of early Christianity changed forever, though damn few at the time realized the true seismic shift this discovery represented. Among those ancient texts, written in Coptic and miraculously preserved in clay jars for over 1,500 years, was a document that would blow apart everything the established churches had preached about salvation, the kingdom of heaven, and the real identity of the human soul. This text, known as the Gospel of Thomas, isn't just another forgotten apocryphal gospel. It's a collection of 114 sayings, straight from Jesus himself, recorded by someone who identified as Judas Thomas, reputed, according to the oldest traditions, to be Christ's twin brother. What makes this gospel such a game-changer isn't just the words it contains, but the words it doesn't. Unlike the canonical gospels we're familiar with, the Gospel of Thomas doesn't bother with miracles, doesn't describe the crucifixion, makes no mention of a physical resurrection, and perhaps most crucially, doesn't set up any need for religious gatekeepers to reach spiritual illumination. Instead, it lays out a raw, unfiltered teaching about the divine spark within every human. A teaching that, if it had been preserved and widely circulated, would have completely upended the religious power structure as we know it. The reason this text stayed hidden for centuries was no accident. Modern academic research reveals that early Christian councils, particularly those that took place between the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, made calculated decisions about which texts would be included in the official canon and which would be branded as heresy. The yardstick they used for these decisions wasn't just about historical chops or how old the manuscripts were, but also about political agendas and doctrinal squabbles that favored establishing a centralized church with absolute, unchallenged authority. The Gospel of Thomas represented a direct shot across the bow of that authority model because it taught that the kingdom of heaven wasn't some place you accessed after you kicked the bucket through some churches say-so, but a state of being that could be reached right here, right now, by anyone who grasped their true nature. One of the real gut-punch lines from this gospel, one you rarely hear quoted in your Sunday sermon, states that the kingdom is inside you and it's outside you. When you get to know yourselves, then you'll be known, and you'll get that you're children of the living Father. This teaching wipes out the whole game plan of external saviors, interceding institutions, and penance systems run by the powers that be. If you're still with me, it's because something deep down recognizes there's a lot more to the story of early Christianity than we've been fed. This ain't a stroll in the park for the faint of heart, because what we're about to explore doesn't just rattle traditional teachings, it challenges our basic understanding of spiritual reality. If that feeling of unease hits you, that need to dig up the whole truth no matter how unsettling it gets, then hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because this is just the first in a whole series where we're going to explore those lost texts, the teachings they tried to bury, and the truths deliberately kept under wraps by those who profit from keeping folks spiritually in the dark. To fully grasp the weight of the Gospel of Thomas and why it was systematically squashed, we got to peel back the layers of history to the context of early Christianity, a period that was a lot more diverse and messy than the official narrative wants us to swallow. For the first 3 centuries after Jesus' death, there were a ton of different Christian communities with wildly different takes on the Nazarene teacher's words. Some of these communities, especially those leaning into Gnostic traditions, held onto teachings that pushed for direct personal knowledge of the divine over blind faith in some external authority. Digs and manuscript studies have revealed that the Gospel of Thomas was very likely composed at a super early date, maybe even between 50 and 70 AD, which would make it one of the oldest Christian documents we've got our hands on, even predating some of the Gospels that made it into the New Testament. This early dating is critical because it hints that the teachings packed into this text might represent some of the most authentic, least filtered traditions of Jesus' original words, before they were messed with and spun by later communities that had specific political and doctrinal agendas. Scholars of early Christianity have identified elements in the Gospel of Thomas that echo seriously ancient oral traditions, especially those floating around in Aramaic-speaking communities in the Middle East, the very language Jesus himself would have spoken. This stands in stark contrast to the canonical Gospels, which were penned in Greek and show Hellenistic influences that popped up decades after Jesus was gone. The fact that the Gospel of Thomas holds on to these early Aramaic traditions suggests we're looking at a much more direct, less watered-down account of the original teachings. But the real game-changer in this Gospel isn't just its age, it's the specific content of its teachings. A close read of the text lays bare a spiritual philosophy that's radically different from what institutional Christianity later cooked up. Instead of fixating on salvation through Jesus' sacrificial death, it lays out a path to enlightenment rooted in self-knowledge and a direct grasp of the divine nature living inside every single person. A deep dive into the sayings packed into the Gospel of Thomas reveals a take on spirituality that swerves sharply from the interpretations later cemented as orthodox. Take saying number 3, where Jesus flat out declares, "The kingdom is inside you, and it's also outside you." Here, we find a perspective that blows past the boundaries of external religious institutions. This teaching suggests the divine experience isn't funneled through priests, rituals, or church structures, but it's right there for the taking through inner understanding. Scholars have pointed out this vibe mirrors spiritual traditions pretty common in first-century mystical Judaism, especially those touched by wisdom traditions that zeroed in on the direct pursuit of divine wisdom. The revolutionary punch of these teachings gets even clearer when you look at saying number 70, where Jesus states, "He who has found the world and become rich, let him renounce the world." This isn't just a jab at materialism. It's an invite to realize that the reality we see through our everyday senses is just the top layer of a much deeper truth beneath it all. Comparative studies have found some wild parallels between these teachings and contemplative traditions from other cultures, suggesting Jesus might have been laying out universal principles of spiritual transformation that cut across specific cultural and religious lines. But maybe the most unsettling part of the Gospel of Thomas for the church brass back then was its heavy emphasis on spiritual equality between men and women. The text holds on to conversations between Jesus and his disciples where they explicitly hash out the role of women on the spiritual path. These references have been systematically downplayed or spun by the patriarchal tradition that took over institutional Christianity, but modern research has shown that early Christian communities dipping into texts like Thomas had much more level leadership structures. Archaeological finds at spots like the Nag Hammadi monastery, where this gospel was uncovered, uncover evidence of mixed monastic communities, where both men and women were stepping up in teaching and spiritual leadership. If you're finding it wild to imagine how these alternative teachings could have totally flipped the script on Christian history, make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep digging into these mysteries that have been buried for nearly 2 millennia. We've got a lot more eye-opening stuff to share about the lost texts and the spiritual traditions that were systematically crushed by the dominant religious institutions. The sheer depth of the teachings packed into the Gospel of Thomas gets even clearer when we look at how it handles the concept of knowledge, or gnosis. Unlike your run-of-the-mill intellectual knowledge, the gnosis here talks about a direct experiential kind of understanding that fundamentally reshapes a person's consciousness. Saying 67, where Jesus talks about knowing oneself, he's not talking about some quick, surface-level self-help introspection, but it's a deep dive into self-discovery that uncovers the divine nature baked into every human being. Experts in comparative mysticism have pointed out this focus on self-knowledge as the road to the divine jives with contemplative traditions that popped up independently in all sorts of cultures, from Hindu Vedanta to Islamic Sufism. What really makes the Gospel of Thomas a game-changer is its implicit rejection of the idea that humans are inherently sinful and needing some outside savior. Instead, the text lays out a spiritual anthropology where the original human state is seen as inherently divine, but obscured by ignorance and false attachments to the material world. This perspective flies directly in the face of original sin and vicarious salvation doctrines that became bedrock for institutional Christianity, and explains why this text was such a big threat to the church power structures that thrived on keeping believers spiritually dependent. Recent investigations into the oral traditions behind the Gospel of Thomas have revealed that many of its sayings hold on to poetic forms and memory aids, hinting at their roots in super-old oral teaching settings. Linguistic analyses have pinned down grammatical constructions and rhetorical patterns typical of first-century Aramaic, which bolsters the idea that we're looking at traditions that trace straight back to communities right there with the historical Jesus. This is a sharp contrast to the canonical Gospels, which clearly show signs of being put together later and reflect theological worries that popped up decades after Jesus was gone. One particularly intriguing angle of the Gospel of Thomas is how it handles the relationship between time and eternity. Several sayings point to an understanding of spiritual reality that transcends everyday time limits. That famous saying, number 18, where the disciples ask about the end of days and Jesus talks about the beginning instead, points to a view where past, present, and future are all just facets of a more fundamental reality that exists way beyond linear time. Studies on mystical consciousness have documented that this timeless perception is a common trait of expanded states of consciousness, suggesting these teachings might be describing authentic mystical experiences rather than just abstract theological musings. The systematic squashing of texts like the Gospel of Thomas was no historical accident. It was the outcome of a calculated process of doctrinal consolidation that kicked off in the 2nd century and ratcheted up big time after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century. The church councils that set the official biblical canon weren't just worried about which texts were authentic, but also about wiping out any teachings that threatened the interpretive monopoly the church authorities were trying to lock down. The canonization process was as much political as it was theological, and the criteria for what got in or out were heavily swayed by power plays and institutional control. The archaeological evidence around the Nag Hammadi discovery has dished out crucial info on how these texts were preserved and why they stayed hidden for so many centuries. Papyrus analyses have shown the manuscripts were carefully buried around 367 AD, right when Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria dropped his famous Paschal letter that definitively set the New Testament canon and ordered the destruction of anything deemed heretical. This timing ain't no coincidence. It strongly suggests the monks of the nearby St. Pachomius Monastery made the calculated decision to save these sacred texts by burying them instead of tossing them out as ordered by the church brass. Studies on the Christian community that held on to these texts have unveiled fascinating patterns in how the teachings of the Gospel of Thomas were kept alive through esoteric traditions that ran parallel to official Christianity. Research in the history of religions has documented that many of the spiritual practices hinted at in Thomas's sayings kept going in monastic communities out in the Egyptian desert, where they cooked up sophisticated techniques of meditation and self-knowledge that deeply resonated with the teachings in this lost gospel. These traditions kept alive a take on Christianity that put direct experience of the divine above sticking to established doctrines. The comparative analysis between the Gospel of Thomas and other Jewish wisdom literature has unearthed surprising connections that shed light on the cultural backdrop where these teachings came from. Scholars have found significant parallels with texts like the Book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and especially the wisdom literature that grew during the intertestamental period. This link suggests Jesus was knee-deep in a tradition of wisdom teaching that championed the pursuit of wisdom as the path to spiritual realization, a perspective that stands in sharp contrast to the salvation-focused approach that later Christianity leaned into. The Gnostic dimension of the Gospel of Thomas presents one of its most distinctive and potentially controversial features. Several sayings hint that true spiritual knowledge isn't gained by poring over sacred texts or going through established rituals, but through an internal journey of self-discovery each person has to take on their own. This epistemological viewpoint offers a radical alternative to the religious authority models that got cemented in institutional Christianity, where spiritual knowledge gets handed down through church hierarchies and validated by sticking to the dogma. If you're itching to find out more about these hidden texts and the truths they contain, I invite you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our deep dives into the mysteries of early Christianity. In the next videos, we'll crack open other lost gospels that have been buried for centuries. Studies into the literary structure of the Gospel of Thomas have revealed a sophisticated organizational pattern that suggests it ain't just some random collection of sayings, but a carefully built work with specific teaching goals. Literary criticism analyses have pinpointed thematic groupings and conceptual progressions, suggesting the text was crafted to lead the reader through a gradual process of spiritual understanding. This teaching structure implies the teachings were meant to be chewed on, sequentially and meditatively studied, rather than just swallowed as doctrinal info. The link between the Gospel of Thomas and later mystical traditions that blossomed in Eastern Christianity has been a hot topic for intense research in the last few decades. Experts in Christian spirituality have documented some wild parallels between Thomas's teachings and the contemplative practices that thrived in Eastern monasticism, especially in traditions tied to the Desert Fathers and later with Byzantine mystical theology. These connections hint that the teachings in the Gospel of Thomas kept on influencing the development of Christian spirituality in ways largely ignored by official church history. The impact of rediscovering the Gospel of Thomas on historical Jesus studies has been nothing short of revolutionary. Researchers have found in this text a unique window into original teachings, not filtered through the theological hang-ups of later communities. Unlike the canonical Gospels, which largely present Jesus through the lens of developed Christology, the Gospel of Thomas holds on to sayings that seem to echo the voice of the Galilean teacher speaking directly to his peers about stuff that mattered right then and there. The ongoing debate surrounding the interpretation of the famous saying about making male and female one has sparked intense discussions among scholars regarding the anthropological implications of Jesus' teachings. Some researchers suggest this teaching reflects an understanding of human nature that moves beyond the binary gender categories prevalent in ancient thought, pointing instead to a vision of spiritual realization involving the integration of traditionally masculine and feminine aspects within the human psyche. This interpretation has proven especially impactful in studies of feminist spirituality and liberation theology. The hermeneutical implications of the Gospel of Thomas's teachings on sacred text interpretation are finally getting serious academic attention. Several sayings hint at an approach to reading spiritual texts that prioritizes intuitive understanding over intellectual analysis, emphasizing the reader's personal transformation as the benchmark for authentic interpretation. This hermeneutical perspective offers a stark alternative to the exegetical methods that evolved within institutional Christianity, where interpretive authority typically resided with academic specialists and ecclesiastical figures. Studying the cultural influences that shaped the teachings preserved in the Gospel of Thomas has uncovered fascinating connections to philosophical and spiritual traditions circulating throughout the Eastern Mediterranean in the 1st century. Researchers have pinpointed echoes of Middle Platonism, certain Hellenistic Jewish currents, and possibly even wisdom traditions with roots in more Eastern cultures. This diverse tapestry of influences suggests Jesus' cultural teaching context was far more cosmopolitan and intellectually rich than traditionally acknowledged. The psychological dimension of the Gospel of Thomas's teachings has drawn the attention of researchers in the psychology of religion and consciousness studies. Several sayings appear to describe altered states of consciousness or mystical experiences, well documented in contemplative traditions across various cultures. Analyses from a transpersonal psychology perspective suggest these teachings might represent an early roadmap to the territories of consciousness spiritual practitioners encounter in their quest for realization. The therapeutic potential within the Gospel of Thomas's teachings is starting to catch the eye of researchers in psychotherapy and holistic healing. Many sayings seem to directly address thought and behavior patterns that lead to psychological suffering, offering radical alternatives to conventional ways of engaging with reality. The teaching about becoming like little children, for instance, has been interpreted by some therapists as an invitation to reclaim a direct, unconditioned perception that defines childhood consciousness before it's shaped by social expectations and emotional trauma. This view posits that Jesus' words, preserved in this text, originally functioned as psychological interventions designed to free listeners from limiting mental patterns. Comparative studies between the Gospel of Thomas's teachings and contemplative traditions from other cultures have unearthed surprising parallels, hinting at universal principles in human spiritual development. Research has documented significant similarities with teachings found in early Buddhist texts, especially those emphasizing the illusory nature of mental constructs and the importance of seeing past superficial appearances to a more fundamental reality. These connections have prompted some academics to propose that Jesus might have accessed Eastern influences via trade routes linking the Mediterranean world with Asia, though this theory remains controversial within more conservative academic circles. A phenomenological approach to studying the Gospel of Thomas has yielded valuable insights into the experiential structure of its teachings. Researchers employing this method focus on describing the states of consciousness the sayings seem intended to evoke in the listener, rather than merely analyzing their doctrinal or historical content. This approach reveals that many of the text's seemingly paradoxical teachings function as catalysts for shifts in perception, designed to disrupt habitual thought patterns and open pathways to alternative forms of understanding. The technique of using paradoxes and apparent contradictions as pedagogical tools finds parallels in educational traditions across diverse cultures, suggesting Jesus might have been trained in sophisticated teaching methodologies, not preserved in conventional Christian sources. Linguistic analysis of the Gospel of Thomas's sayings offers intriguing evidence for the possible Aramaic origins of many of its teachings, bolstering arguments for their antiquity and authenticity. The Semitic thought patterns underlying numerous sayings suggest that, while the text we possess isn't Coptic, it stems from sources originating in the first-century Palestinian cultural milieu. This linguistic evidence has been particularly compelling for academics initially skeptical about the text's potential to preserve authentic material from Jesus. Studies have identified poetic structures and mnemonic devices characteristic of the Jewish oral tradition, indicating these sayings were originally crafted for memorization and oral transmission before being committed to writing. Research into the sociological implications of the Gospel of Thomas's teachings has unveiled how many sayings articulate a radical critique of the hierarchical structures prevalent in ancient society. Teachings on the fundamental spiritual equality of all human beings, regardless of social status, gender, or ethnic background, were revolutionary concepts in the first-century context. Studies have documented how these egalitarian perspectives likely contributed to early Christianity's appeal among marginalized populations, before ecclesiastical structures institutionalized new forms of hierarchy and exclusion. The absence of references to church authorities or institutional structures in the Gospel of Thomas suggests it preserves a vision of spirituality fundamentally anti-institutional in its orientation. Interdisciplinary approaches, blending methods from archaeology, cultural anthropology, and religious studies, have begun to paint a richer picture for understanding the social world where the Gospel of Thomas's teachings originated. Archaeological digs in Galilee have unearthed evidence of a far more diverse and cosmopolitan society than traditionally assumed, with cultural influences stretching from Egypt to Mesopotamia. This cultural diversity provides a plausible backdrop for the philosophical sophistication and breadth of perspectives characterizing the text's preserved teachings. Anthropological studies of religious practices in the Eastern Mediterranean during the Hellenistic period have identified patterns of syncretism and cultural adaptation that could explain how originally Jewish teachings might have incorporated elements from broader philosophical and spiritual traditions. The artistic and aesthetic dimension of the Gospel of Thomas's teachings has captivated scholars of literature and religious poetics. Many sayings exhibit a sophisticated poetic structure, employing parallelism, metaphor, and symbolism in ways that transcend mere communication of doctrinal information. Literary analyses suggest these teachings were crafted to function as verbal works of art, impacting both the emotional and intellectual aspects of human experience. The aesthetic beauty of many sayings may have been a significant factor in their preservation and transmission, as poetic forms tend to be more memorable and resistant to corruption during oral transmission. This artistic dimension suggests Jesus might have been not only a religious teacher but also a wordsmith who understood beauty's power to convey spiritual truths. Studies on the contemporary reception of the Gospel of Thomas have documented its growing influence in alternative spirituality movements, contemplative meditation, and transpersonal psychology. Many modern practitioners report that the text's teachings offer a refreshing alternative to forms of Christianity they perceive as overly focused on doctrinal beliefs and insufficiently oriented toward direct experience of the sacred. Study groups centered on the Gospel of Thomas have popped up across diverse religious traditions, including not just progressive Christian circles, but also Buddhist, Sufi, and eclectic spirituality communities. This cross-traditional embrace suggests the text's teachings articulate spiritual principles that transcend specific denominational boundaries. Research into the epistemological implications of the Gospel of Thomas reveals that many of its teachings articulate a theory of knowledge that prioritizes direct experience over information gleaned from external sources. The sayings repeatedly suggest that spiritual truth must be discovered through inner exploration, rather than accepted based on external authorities or inherited traditions. This epistemological perspective presents a radical alternative to forms of Christianity that emphasize faith in specific doctrinal propositions as the primary path to salvation. Contemporary philosophers have identified parallels between this approach to knowledge and currents in modern philosophy that highlight the primacy of phenomenological experience in shaping human understanding. The political dimension of the Gospel of Thomas shines through when we examine how its teachings challenged both the religious and secular power structures dominating the first-century world. Historical research has documented that the Roman Empire maintained control not solely through military might, but also by promoting religious systems that legitimized imperial authority and fostered social conformity. The Christianity that eventually became the empire's official religion had developed hierarchical structures reflecting and reinforcing the Roman political order, with bishops acting as intermediaries between divine power and common believers. The Gospel of Thomas, however, offers a radically different vision that eliminates the need for religious intermediaries and suggests every individual has direct access to divine wisdom. This perspective posed a fundamental threat not just to established religious authority, but also to a social order reliant on clear hierarchies and defined social roles. Studies on the social contexts of the early Christian centuries reveal that communities preserving texts like the Gospel of Thomas often existed on the fringes of dominant society, developing communal lifestyles that defied conventional norms around property, family, and social status. The Gospel's sayings emphasizing detachment from material possessions and questioning traditional family ties weren't merely abstract spiritual teachings. They were political statements challenging the economic and social foundations of the Roman imperial order. Archaeological investigations have provided evidence that some early Christian communities experimented with communal living, including shared property, gender equality, and non-hierarchical leadership structures. These radical social practices may have been partly inspired by interpretations of teachings, such as those preserved in the Gospel of Thomas. The link between ecclesiastical power and the control of sacred texts becomes a critical issue when we consider why certain Gospels were included in the official canon while others were rejected or suppressed. Specialists in church history have documented that decisions about which texts would be deemed authentic and authoritative weren't solely based on theological considerations. They also mirrored power struggles among different factions within early Christianity. Communities with greater political influence and economic resources had a stronger capacity to promote their preferred texts, and marginalized traditions they saw as threats to their authority. The Gospel of Thomas, with its emphasis on direct individual experience and its lack of reference to institutional structures, represented a model of Christianity incompatible with the political ambitions of leaders aiming to establish a powerful, centralized church. Research into the transmission of ancient texts has revealed that the preservation and destruction of manuscripts often reflected political considerations more than purely academic or spiritual ones. Scribes and librarians working under the patronage of ecclesiastical authorities had clear incentives to preserve texts supporting official doctrinal positions while allowing problematic texts to deteriorate or vanish. The Gospel of Thomas's survival in the sands of Egypt represents a historical accident that sidestepped these control mechanisms, offering a unique window into traditions that would otherwise have been entirely erased from the historical record. Studies of medieval monastic libraries have documented cases where texts deemed heretical were deliberately destroyed or buried, suggesting the loss of many Gnostic texts wasn't simply the result of natural decay. Analysis of the rhetorical strategies employed by the Church Fathers to combat Gnostic teachings uncovers a systematic campaign designed not just to refute specific ideas, but to thoroughly delegitimize entire traditions of Christian interpretation. Polemical writings from figures like Irenaeus and Tertullian utilized characterization techniques that portrayed Gnostics not as Christians with different interpretations, but as malicious deceivers deliberately distorting gospel truth. This rhetorical strategy effectively created a public perception that texts like the Gospel of Thomas represented late corruptions of authentic Christianity, rather than legitimate traditions preserving important aspects of Jesus' original teachings. Research into ancient religious propaganda has shown these delegitimization campaigns often exaggerated differences between Christian traditions to create impressions of irreconcilable division where significant areas of overlap and agreement actually existed. The economic dimension of doctrinal control becomes starkly evident when we consider how religious authority translated into economic power and vice versa. Christian communities that developed complex institutional structures required funding systems reliant on the loyalty and obedience of believers. Teachings promoting spiritual self-sufficiency and questioning the need for religious intermediaries posed direct threats to these economic systems. The Gospel of Thomas, with its message that the kingdom of heaven is available to anyone who develops proper understanding, fundamentally undermined the basis for religious systems that relied on creating and maintaining spiritual dependency. Studies on religious economics in the ancient world have documented how religious institutions amassed considerable wealth through donations, tithes, and other mechanisms requiring believers to trust in the institution's spiritual authority. Research into religious resistance has identified patterns where marginalized communities preserved alternative spiritual traditions as forms of cultural and political resistance against dominant powers. For some communities, the Gospel of Thomas may have functioned as a resistance text, providing spiritual resources to maintain distinct identities in the face of pressure to conform to emerging Orthodox Christianity. Sayings emphasizing the importance of not blindly following religious leaders or questioning inherited traditions would have resonated especially with groups experiencing marginalization or persecution for their non-conforming beliefs. This resistance function might explain why texts like the Gospel of Thomas continued to be copied and studied in clandestine communities long after official authorities declared them heretical. Studying ancient world communication networks has uncovered how ideas and texts flowed through both official and clandestine channels. The Gospel of Thomas likely circulated primarily through informal networks of spiritual teachers, merchants, and travelers who sympathized with its teachings, but lacked access to official distribution channels controlled by established ecclesiastical authorities. This covert circulation would have demanded high levels of personal commitment from individuals willing to risk social censure or even persecution to preserve and transmit the teachings. Analyses of ancient text distribution patterns suggest that documents like the Gospel of Thomas may have traveled considerable distances via these informal networks, reaching communities in geographically distant regions that shared similar spiritual orientations. The power dynamics surrounding the suppression of the Gospel of Thomas reveal fascinating aspects of how emerging religious structures leveraged information control as a fundamental tool to establish and maintain authority. Studies on ancient religious communication have documented how institutions developed sophisticated systems to determine which texts would be considered authentic and which would be relegated to oblivion. This selection process wasn't merely theological, it heavily involved political considerations, economic and social factors that reflected the interests of specific groups seeking to consolidate their dominant position within the evolving religious landscape. Analysis of the methods used to discredit texts like the Gospel of Thomas reveals systematic patterns that go beyond simple doctrinal differences. Research has identified deliberate strategies that included associating non-orthodox texts with groups deemed dangerous or subversive, creating narratives that presented these teachings as corruptions of pure traditions, and establishing criteria for authenticity that favored documents supporting existing authority structures. These tactics were particularly effective because they operated on both intellectual and emotional levels, appealing to concerns about historical accuracy as well as fears about social and spiritual stability. The psychological dimension of doctrinal control becomes evident when we examine how religious authorities employed persuasion techniques that fostered emotional and cognitive dependence. Studies in religious psychology have documented how certain types of teachings promote spiritual autonomy, while others encourage reliance on external authority figures. The Gospel of Thomas, with its emphasis on direct knowledge and personal experience, represented a model that empowered individuals to develop independent relationships with the divine. This kind of spiritual autonomy was fundamentally incompatible with systems that required believers to depend on priests, bishops, or other institutional figures to access salvation or spiritual understanding. Research into religious manipulation has revealed how dominant groups utilized information isolation techniques to control the narratives available to their followers. By restricting access to alternative texts and creating severe social consequences for those who explored unauthorized teachings, these institutions effectively molded their communities' perceptions of spiritual reality. The Gospel of Thomas, with its sayings that encouraged seekers to trust their own experience and understanding, provided cognitive tools that could help individuals resist this type of informational manipulation. The study of cultural resistance in religious contexts has documented how marginalized communities developed sophisticated strategies to preserve alternative traditions while navigating external pressures to conform. These strategies included the use of coded language, the creation of secret communication networks, and the development of ritual practices that could be performed privately without attracting unwanted attention. The Gospel of Thomas, with its aphoristic style and use of symbolism, was particularly well suited for this type of clandestine preservation because its teachings could be easily memorized and transmitted orally without requiring physical documents that could be discovered and confiscated. Analyses of resistance networks in the ancient world have revealed complex structures that connected geographically dispersed communities sharing similar spiritual orientations. These networks operated using systems of codes, symbols, and practices that allowed members to identify each other and share resources without attracting the attention of hostile authorities. Research suggests that texts like the Gospel of Thomas circulated through these networks, reaching communities from Syria to Egypt, and possibly as far as India, where similar traditions about direct knowledge and personal realization already existed. The international dimension of the Gospel of Thomas's suppression becomes evident when we consider how different geographical regions responded to pressures to adopt uniform orthodoxies. Studies on regional religious diversity have documented how communities in peripheral areas of the Roman Empire often maintained distinctive spiritual traditions much longer than those in metropolitan centers, where institutional pressure was more intense. This explains why copies of the Gospel of Thomas were preserved in places like Nag Hammadi in Egypt, where monastic communities were able to maintain libraries of diverse texts without the direct supervision of central authorities. Research on the preservation of ancient texts has revealed that the survival of documents like the Gospel of Thomas required deliberate and sustained efforts from individuals and communities committed to keeping spiritual diversity alive. This preservation process involved not only the physical copying of manuscripts, but also the transmission of interpretive traditions that allowed future generations to understand and apply the teachings in ways relevant to their specific contexts. Analyses of preservation techniques have shown that communities valuing these texts developed sophisticated methods to protect them from physical deterioration and unwanted discovery. The study of psychological motivations behind the preservation of forbidden texts has identified complex factors ranging from deep religious convictions to feelings of resistance against unjust authority. Individuals who risked social censure or persecution to keep these texts alive were often motivated by personal experiences of spiritual transformation that had resulted from engaging with the teachings. These experiences created deep emotional commitments that transcended personal safety considerations and led people to view the preservation of the texts as a sacred responsibility. Investigations into the long-term impact of doctrinal suppression have revealed how the loss of textual diversity impoverished the development of Christian thought for centuries. By eliminating alternative voices like those represented in the Gospel of Thomas, dominant institutions created orthodoxies that, while providing stability and unity, also limited the capacity of Christian traditions to evolve and adapt to new cultural contexts and intellectual challenges. Comparative studies have shown that religious traditions that maintained greater textual and interpretive diversity tended to demonstrate greater flexibility and creativity in responding to historical and cultural changes. The analysis of unintended consequences of textual suppression has documented how efforts to eliminate alternative teachings sometimes created effects contrary to what was desired. The prohibition of texts like the Gospel of Thomas could increase their appeal to individuals who felt drawn to ideas considered dangerous or subversive by established authorities. This psychological dynamic, known as the forbidden fruit effect, meant that suppression efforts could inadvertently create interest and curiosity about the very teachings they sought to eliminate. Studies on the rediscovery of lost texts in later periods have revealed how ideas preserved in documents like the Gospel of Thomas resurfaced in spiritual movements that emerged centuries after the original suppression. Medieval mystics, Protestant reformers, and modern spiritual seekers have found in these ancient texts resources that resonated with their own quests for direct and authentic religious experience. This persistence suggests that the human needs these teachings satisfied were not eliminated by their official suppression, but continued to manifest in new forms throughout history. Research on the impact of modern archaeological discoveries has documented how the rediscovery of texts like the Gospel of Thomas has transformed academic understanding of early Christianity and provided new perspectives on the diversity of spiritual traditions that existed in the first centuries of the Christian era. These discoveries have revealed that the development of Orthodox Christianity was a much more complex and contested process than traditional narratives had suggested, and that alternative voices like those preserved in the Gospel of Thomas represented legitimate traditions with their own rich histories and sophisticated interpretive traditions. The study of the contemporary relevance of these ancient teachings has shown that many of the central themes of the Gospel of Thomas continue to resonate with modern spiritual seekers who value personal experience over institutional authority and who seek forms of spirituality that emphasize inner growth and personal realization. Research on contemporary spirituality has documented a resurgence of interest in traditions that promote direct knowledge and mystical experience, suggesting that the human needs the Gospel of Thomas addressed remain relevant for people navigating spiritual challenges in the modern world. Analyses of lessons learned from the history of suppression and rediscovery of the Gospel of Thomas have identified important principles regarding the significance of preserving intellectual and spiritual diversity. These studies suggest that healthy societies require multiple perspectives and voices to develop robust and adaptable understandings of spiritual and human reality. The temporary loss of the Gospel of Thomas serves as a reminder of how the concentration of power in individual institutions can lead to the impoverishment of intellectual and spiritual traditions, while its rediscovery demonstrates the resilience of ideas that satisfy fundamental human needs and the importance of keeping channels open for diverse spiritual exploration. The legacy of the Gospel of Thomas in the 21st century reflects both the historical loss caused by its suppression and the renewed possibilities created by its rediscovery. Studies on its impact on contemporary spiritual movements have documented how its teachings on direct knowledge, personal transformation, and independent spiritual seeking have provided valuable resources for individuals seeking alternatives to traditional forms of institutional religion. At the same time, its history of suppression and clandestine preservation serves as a powerful testament to the importance of protecting spiritual diversity and resisting efforts to impose doctrinal uniformity. Final reflections on the significance of the Gospel of Thomas invite us to consider not only what this specific text teaches us about spirituality and personal development, but also what its history reveals about broader dynamics of power, authority, and resistance that continue to influence how societies approach religious and philosophical differences. Its message that every person has potential access to profound spiritual truth remains radical in contexts where institutions seek to maintain control over religious experience, while its emphasis on personal development and direct understanding offers valuable resources for anyone committed to authentic spiritual growth.